Halo has been around for 21 years now, a fact that always makes me feel a bit old. I've been playing it for the entire duration of its existence, and basically for the entirety of my existence too. What always amazes me about Halo though is that I'm still able to make new discoveries, even in some of the oldest titles like Halo CE or Halo 2. I was recently goofing around in Halo 2 when I came upon a sentinel shooting a needler, something I had never noticed in my copious campaign completions, and it got me thinking. What other weird enemies are hidden throughout the Halo franchise? Surely there are more oddities that I have yet to discover. So I went through every first-person Halo game looking high and low for unusual adversaries with unique models, weird weapon combinations, odd behaviors, or with strange traits. I also tried to find bad guys that were a bit hidden or strange in a way that's not obvious. So bosses, for the most part, aren't part of this list. Yes, Briglard is unique. Yes, Tartarus is unique. But those types of enemies are too obvious, too in your face. Let's take a peek at those that are often overlooked, starting with the ones that call Halo CE their home. The very first odd enemy you can run into is on the Pillar of Autumn. This Sangheili only spawns on easier difficulties and is the only elite in the game that can't and won't actually kill you. Instead, he just runs off. Also on the Pillar of Autumn, if you murder Captain Keyes or some other friendlies after receiving the Magnum, a special group of would-be allies appears. This battle-hardened group is invincible and instantly hostile to you, making these Marines some of the only ones that are aggressive right when they spawn. On Legendary, the room they come from contains an Easter egg, if you're lucky enough to make it in. The next anomaly can only be reached by performing a glitch often used by speedrunners. On the Silent Cartographer, if you drive full speed up to this door on a Warthog and turn your vehicle last second, the momentum of your movement will cause the vehicle to swing around, slamming into you and propelling you through the door early. This not only skips a large portion of the mission, but leaves you with this friendly gold elite. He doesn't mind if you shoot him in the back or the face. I have no idea why, but if you haul ass into this room with a ghost and quickly get out, sometimes one of the elites just breaks. His AI completely shuts down and he becomes friendly. It seems to have something to do with the quantity of ghosts. It's like he can't make up his mind on which one to get in or something. He's like, grab another one of those ghosts and drive it to the active camo elite. Exit the vehicle near him and he'll quickly get in. Not only can you see an active camo elite piloting a vehicle, which is already weird, but if you manage to flip him over, this happens. His sword disappears, but if you get too close, he'll still slap the shit out of you. On Assault on the Control Room, if you bring a ghost all the way up to this big door, you can actually push yourself through it by gliding towards it sideways and exiting the vehicle. This forces you through the geometry without activating the switch, which also happens to trigger all of the enemy AI in the room. Much like the Gold Elite on the Silent Cartographer, none of these guys care if you attack them. The Mission 343 Guilty Spark contains the only instance of friendly flood forms in CE. While walking through the jungle, there are several moments where an elite combat form will appear and quickly run off into the distance. When you pass by them, they actually show up yellow on your motion tracker. They're also invincible. No matter how many times you kill them, they get back up and eventually disappear. This one is a little more obvious, but I'm including it anyways. Still on 343 Guilty Spark is the Crazy Marine. You have to run into him to progress through the level, but he is unique regardless. 2 Betrayals contains the only 2 red grunts with fuel rod cannons. They exit out of one of the doors on the big stone archway and even have a special model and anniversary graphics. Every other Ungoy with a fuel rod are black Spec Ops grunts. I can't help but feel like there's some kind of hidden lore behind these 2 guys or something. Also on 2 Betrayals are the only flood infection forms that are unaware of your presence. You'll find these by simply progressing through the level. Chances are you blasted them away without even realizing that they just don't care about you. Right at the start of Keyes, a grunt and an elite combat form run by. The interesting thing about this elite combat form is it's the only one in the entire series that spawns without arms or a head, rendering it completely harmless. In one of the many hallways of the Truth and Reconciliation on the mission Keyes, a group of several grunts and a singular hunter spawn. This is the only hunter in CE that spawns by itself and is really easy to overlook. The path to get to him is completely out of the way. The next group of weird enemies are accessed via a glitch that can only be done using the armless flood form that I mentioned earlier. If you restart the mission, then pause it the moment you've restarted, you'll be able to revert to the last checkpoint. By doing that and setting your controls a certain way, the combatless combat form will always revive itself when you kill it, which will allow you to perform a specific glitch. You've got to lead him all the way to the back of the room, stand in a specific spot, kill him, then stand on his body. When he revives, he'll force you through the wall, skipping the entire mission. If you walk back into this room, all the enemies for this area will spawn, but they'll have no AI or animations. Their behavior in general is really weird at this point. Killing them produces some strange results. If you want a detailed explanation of how this glitch works, check the link in the description. Splee5556 has a great tutorial. The final mission in CE has several odd enemies, the first of which is a human combat form that is allied with the Covenant. This guy spawns normally, but seeing him is difficult if you're not quick because he usually dies pretty easily. The Covenant won't shoot at him, and look at this infection form, it's clinging onto him as if he's a regular human. Weird. In the armory of the Pillar of Autumn on the mission The Maw, a group of active camo combat forms will spawn if you linger in the room for too long. These are the only active camo flood in the game, and some of the only ones in the entire series. This one is pretty obvious, but in the area where you have to throw grenades into those tiny orange vents, you can encounter 343 Guilty Spark, who is obviously hostile, but he also shows up on your radar and your reticle turns red when you aim at him, so technically an enemy. Once you get to the bridge in the Warthog Run section of the Maw, Echo 419 gets shot down by a couple of Banshees, both of which are actually always open for some reason. They look really strange flying by with the hatch just sticking up like that. They're easy to miss because you're not really supposed to stick around, you know, considering the entire ship is about to explode. The final goofy enemy in CE is the famous food nipple grunt. Towards the end of the Warthog Run is a tube off to the side that leads towards this little guy. Not only is this grunt not hostile, but he has some pretty funny dialogue.
Good thing that food nipple's waiting for me at the starship, 'cause man, if I weren't up a big grunty thirst.
On to Halo 2, starting with Cairo Station. In the first room, right where the combat starts in the game, if you defeat a couple of groups of enemies as they come through the door without exiting the room, 2 elites will come from a door above, wielding dual plasma pistols. This is the only time in the series that an elite dual wields plasma pistols, and it just looks really weird. At the end of Cairo Station, in the final room with the bomb, an elite with a plasma rifle needler combo guards the explosive, but only on higher difficulties. Outskirts is one of the very few Halo missions with 2 hidden skulls, one of which is the I Would Have Been Your Daddy skull, and it's infamous for being difficult to obtain thanks to its finicky spawn rules. If you are able to grab it, and it only spawns on Legendary by the way, you're thrown into a small arena with nothing but a plasma pistol and hordes of high-level elites. These elites shoot at you with battle rifles, more plasma rifle needler combos, plasma rifle SMG combos, and terrifyingly, beam rifles. Enemy elites never use these weapons in any other section of the game, and these guys are terrifying. On the Arbiter, if you load up the mission on Legendary, progress to the Banshee section and fly under this bridge, a circle of heretic grunts dance around the grunt birthday party skull. No matter what you do to them, they're never hostile. Every single player comes face to face with this holodrone on the Oracle, but the interesting thing about this particular one, unlike the ones faced during the boss fight at the end of the mission, is this one is completely invincible. Similarly to the grunts on the Arbiter, the Oracle also has a skull that only appears on Legendary, and is surrounded by 4 elite combat forms that sort of just wiggle on the ground. They never fully revive themselves. On the outside of one of the final structures in the mission Delta Halo are a few jackals wielding plasma rifles. This is the only time they ever have these in Halo 2, and for some reason it just looks wrong to me. Just beyond the plasma rifle jackals are 2 active camo elites in a constant loop of an enraged animation. Much like the grunts and flood forms surrounding the other skulls I mentioned, these elites are harmless despite their intimidating appearance. They spawn with the Envy skull, only on Legendary. On Regret, there's a flooded room full of camoed enemies, some of which are grunts. These are some of the only enemy grunts in the entire series that use active camo. Further into the mission, only on Legendary, around the back of one of the structures in the lake, are a couple of active camo elites with energy swords that stand over a skull. Much like the elites in Delta Halo, they constantly loop through an enraged animation. On Sacred Icon, there's a brief opportunity where you can find hostile Marines. You play as the Arbiter in this mission before the UNSC made a truce with him, so it makes sense for them to want to kill you. Most people would never actually come into contact with these Marines because they're on the opposite side of this big hole. And if you don't quickly get across with a grenade jump, or just fly across with acrophobia, they'll get killed by the flood or just despawn. The next mission, Quarantine Zone, has a very peculiar sentinel. This is the guy I mentioned in the beginning of the video. It's the only aggressor sentinel in the entire series that uses a needler instead of a sentinel beam. It's easy to overlook when fighting though, because it's surrounded by typical sentinels. And I don't know about you, but I don't typically stop and observe what I'm being shot at with. I tend to just take out whatever is shooting me. Quarantine Zone is also the only time throughout any Halo campaign that the Flood drive vehicles, meaning this is the only time you'll fight hostile warthogs and tanks, unless you're a frequent team killer. One of the vehicles you'll encounter is a Flood-occupied Gosshog, which is horrifying. Right before boarding the gondola, if a combat form hijacks your ghost and you drive far enough through this door while he's on the hood, his AI disables and he just chills. No free rides, buddy. Gravemind has quite a few interesting irregularities, such as this single hunter. Much like the single hunter in CE, this guy is the only hunter that spawns alone in Halo 2. Right next to the single hunter are a couple of Spec Ops elites, which don't seem that unusual at first glance, but the Spec Ops elites encountered in this mission are the only hostile ones in the game, unless you start team killing as Arbiter. Gravemind is one of the most relentless missions in the entire series, and collecting the skull on this mission reflects that. Not only do you have to go through this difficult mission on Legendary, but once you finally get to the skull, it's protected by an active camo grunt using a fuel rod cannon, the only one of its kind, in Halo 2. Shortly after the camo grunt is a group of enraged brutes chasing after grunts. The interesting thing about these guys is not only do the brutes start off enraged, which is the only time this ever happens, but the grunts always flee, even if the brutes are dispatched. In the next big open garden area are some Spec Ops grunts. Much like the elites I mentioned earlier, these are the only enemy Spec Ops grunts encountered in Halo 2. Still on Gravemind, in one of the final rooms where Blow Me Away plays, is a white elite with a fuel rod cannon. This is the only time an enemy elite spawns with one of these bad boys. After clearing out the room with the white fuel rod elite, or waiting for a while, several elites will come out of the door on the far side of the room. The last elite that comes through the door is the odd one out. His armor combo is unlike any others seen throughout the entire franchise. But that's not even the weirdest part. This is just one of 16 different variations of this elite that can spawn. There are 3 variables that change with this elite every time he spawns. His armor light color, which is either blue or orange, the type of helmet he's wearing, and finally, whether or not he's missing half of his jaw, much like the Shipmaster, the friendly white elite encountered throughout the Arbiter sections of the game. Let's run through every version of the elite real quick. Minor helmet, blue lights, which has a unique anniversary model. Minor helmet, orange lights. Minor helmet, half jaw, blue lights. Minor helmet, half jaw, orange lights. Honor guard helmet, blue lights, which has a unique anniversary model. Honor guard helmet, orange lights. Honor guard helmet, half jaw, blue lights. Honor guard helmet, half jaw, orange lights. Counselor helmet, blue lights, which has a unique anniversary model. Counselor helmet, orange lights. Counselor helmet, half jaw, blue lights. Counselor helmet, half jaw, orange lights. Weird Counselor helmet, blue lights. Weird Counselor helmet, orange lights. Weird Counselor helmet, half jaw, blue lights. And Weird Counselor helmet, half jaw, orange lights. On High Charity, there's a larger open area thick with flood fog that contains some of the only active camo combat forms in the game. This is the only place a human combat form can spawn with camo at all, unless you have the Assassin Skull enabled, but we'll get to that later. Their weapons vary from spawn to spawn. A little bit later on in the same mission is the only elite combat form that ever wields a brute shot. The final mission of Halo 2, The Great Journey, contains a few weird enemies. The first you'll encounter are these brutes and ghosts. They may not look strange at first, but if you hijack them, you'll see they're using plasma rifles instead of brute plasma rifles, which, of course, is the only time this ever happens in Halo 2. Use your own weapons, guys, come on. Much like the brutes driving the ghosts, if you hijack a brute in a Banshee later in the mission and they actually manage to survive the fall, you'll see that they have no weapons at all and are forced to attack you with nothing but a piercing gaze. Also included in Halo 2 is a special skull called Assassins. This makes every single enemy in the game always have active camo, which produces some interesting enemies that you'd never see otherwise. Here are some quick notable examples. Camo jetpack elites, drones, jackals, sniper jackals, hunters, heretic elites and heretic grunts, aggressor sentinels, carrier forms, the heretic leader and his holodrones, honor guards, regret, constructor sentinels, enforcer sentinels, marines, brutes, Tartarus, and literally every other weird enemy I already mentioned. Halo 3 also has its fair share of unique and strange enemies, starting with this grunt that uses a UNSC chain gun turret to fire at a pelican on higher difficulties. Sporadically throughout Savo Highway on higher difficulties are sniper towers which contain brutes using beam rifles. This one in particular is an idiot. Some of the phantoms in Halo 3 contain grunts that use spike rifles. Normally they hang out on each plasma turret on the side of the vehicle. You'll typically never see what they're holding because most of the times when you destroy a phantom, everyone inside is killed during the explosion. But if you kill this particular phantom right as it's dropping off a wraith, they survive. Thanks to Generalkidd for this one. His video talking about this is in the description. If you try and collect all of the game's achievements, then you're likely already aware of this human combat form on Floodgate that jumps over you in the beginning of the mission. If you kill it right as it passes over the path forward, it'll drop a skull. Eventually some drop pods will fall from the sky carrying several elites, one of which is Red. If he dies and is infected by the Flood, this is the first possible instance of a Red elite combat form, which never spawns naturally. Bashing one of the white elite corpses into the last areas of the mission can create a unique white elite combat form. Much like the Red variant, these guys never spawn naturally and can only be created by an infection form reanimating a body. If you're quick enough to board this scarab early on the arc, you can create a very strange enemy. You need to rush to one of the plasma turrets on the side, Wait for it to climb up and out of the map, then destroy the core. Once it's dead, if you make your way back down and hit the load zone that would trigger the scarab to come back, this happens. A zombie scarab! Thanks again to Generalkidd for this one. His video about it is in the description. A bit further into the mission and you'll come face to face with a brute in his pack. This brute actually has a name, Cathagus. This encounter is unique because it's the only time that brutes aren't instantly hostile. His packmates won't attack you until you attack them or until he dies fighting you. There's some interesting lore behind this guy and a few other enemies throughout Halo. If you're interested in that, leave a comment letting me know and I'll make a video similar to this detailing the lore behind the special enemies you fight throughout the Halo games. During the Hornet section of the mission, The Covenant, one phantom in particular will actually pursue you. This is the only phantom in the game that does this. All others are on scripted paths and always run away from you. Every Banshee in the area actually contains a weird brute. If you hijack him and he survives the fall, he'll have no weapons and he just kind of chills there. Bizarrely, the brute combat form holding a gravity hammer in the beginning of the final mission in Halo 3 is the only one that ever uses this weapon. There are a few elite combat forms using fuel rod cannons in this mission as well. They don't do that anywhere else in Halo 3. You may also run into human combat forms with rocket launchers, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. Though this is the only mission you'll see that in Halo 3. If you carry an auto turret into the final section of the game after defeating 343 Guilty Spark and throw it down, it will be hostile to you. During the Warthog run, if you travel slightly off the beaten path, you can encounter the Jerkstore grunt. Much like the secret grunt in Halo CE, this guy will never attack you with weapons, only harsh, painful words.
Hey, demon! The Jerkstore called, and they're all out of you!
Halo 3 also has a few enemy types that can be found in multiplayer. The Aggressor Sentinels and Constructor Sentinels. I'm sure you've seen them before, but I bet you didn't know they're considered hostile and can actually be killed. Aggressor Sentinels may be common throughout Halo 3's campaign, but finding enemies in multiplayer is weird to me, so I'm including them. The towers on Sandtrap actually have an AI in them. They watch you to determine where the mines need to come out of the ground and will shoot you with a laser that is very hard to see. The turrets on Snowbound are also hostile to the player. Isolation has a bunch of nasty flood sacks on the underside of the play space. Outside of cold storage are a few flood infection forms. There's a flood tank form inside a tube on this map as well. The towers of Sandbox have an AI in them that behaves similarly to the ones on Sandtrap. They'll actively try and kill anyone that ventures out into the desert. Halo 3 ODST doesn't have as many interesting enemies as previous titles, but it still has a few, such as the hostile NMPD officer on Data Hive. He only becomes hostile to you if you have collected every single audio file collectible hidden throughout the Mombasa streets. Shortly after the bad cop is a one-of-a-kind drone. Much like the brute Cathagus that I mentioned in Halo 3, this guy has some interesting lore behind him. He also happens to be the only drone encountered in campaign with a shield generator and brute plasma rifle. Halo 3 ODST was the first Halo game to debut with Firefight, and when that was eventually added to the Master Chief Collection, several new enemy types were added to the mode that were never encountered in ODST prior. They added hostile elites, aggressor sentinels, infection forms, carrier forms, elite combat forms, red elite combat forms, marine combat forms, brute combat forms, tanks, stalkers, ranged forms, and two completely new combat forms that didn't exist until Flood Firefight was added to ODST. They are ODST combat forms and civilian combat forms. The Flood were also given the ability to drive vehicles again, something they didn't even do in Halo 3. Halo Reach has quite a few oddities too. Starting with Winter Contingency, there's an active camo elite that only spawns on Legendary and is carrying a collectible called a data pad. If you don't kill him quick enough, he'll run away and despawn. Shortly after the elite, using a few trick jumps or the Acrophobia skull, you can get on top of an invisible wall that sits above this building. If you do this before you enter through the door below, you can find a super small skirmisher on the roof. If you were to proceed through the building, it would grow to its normal size and run off. Look at how cute he is. Using the same glitch to get to the tiny skirmisher, you can skip a load zone that is supposed to activate the enemy's AI in the next section of the mission. This entire first group of enemies is now completely friendly to both you and the rest of Noble Team, no matter how many times you attack them. If you EMP the Falcon before it's able to land, in the section where you're supposed to clear an LZ, you can either fly it towards or lead an elite to the cockpit of the vehicle. He'll hijack whoever's piloting the Falcon, throwing them out of the aircraft, but in the process becomes weaponless. He is not happy about it either. On the next mission, ONI Sword Base, inside the building itself is a group of plasma rifle wielding grunts, the only ones of their kind throughout the entirety of Reach's campaign. Nightfall contains the only instance of hostile wildlife found in any Halo game. These big guys are called Guta, and though they may be obvious, I wanted to include them regardless because they're awesome. If you're paying attention during Tip of the Spear, at one point you'll hear Noble Team discussing an elite zealot and how he isn't top priority, but to kill him if given the chance. Well, this guy's unique because if you don't get to him and kill him quickly, he'll run away and completely despawn. Once you get to Long Night of Solace, a large battle takes place on the beach. If you were to somehow manage to get yourself on top of one of the spirit dropships that brings in enemy reinforcements and enable armor lock, you'll be carried past an invisible barrier, and the spirit you're riding on top of will shrink. A bit further into the mission and you'll board a saber, engaging in dogfights outside of the Anchor 9 space station. You're tasked with fighting several squadrons of Banshees and Seraphs, but the Banshees are actually a special variant only encountered in this section of Reach. If you progress to the waypoint on this bridge during Exodus, quickly backtrack to the door you came from, then use Acrophobia or Jetpack to fly out this way, a group of shielded jackals, grunts, and a jackal sniper will be there to greet you. The weird thing about some of the grunts in the jackal sniper though is that they're completely invincible. Headshots, assassinations, grenades, they don't do a thing. On to New Alexandria. If you're able to hijack a Banshee, you'll find that none of them actually have any drivers, which is weird. There's a hidden switch by the hospital building that, when activated, makes all of the enemies within Club Herrera dance. There's even a DJ Brute. In the beginning of the Pillar of Autumn, you'll run into a couple of scarabs. These guys are unique because the scarabs in Reach are unkillable, the only Halo game that has scarabs that you can't actually defeat. During the Pillar of Autumn, you're forced to come in contact with a jackal wielding a plasma rifle. As you can probably guess, this is the only time this happens. It's pretty easy to miss though. In the end of the mission, right before boarding the Mat Cannon, there's an elite zealot with a fuel rod. When approached, he'll swap to an energy sword. As far as I know, this is the only elite in any of the earlier Halo games that can actually swap weapons. Every mission in Halo Reach has a hidden elite called a Bob. Typically adorned in gold ranger armor, they always run away from you and eventually despawn. Here's one on Winter Contingency. Oni Swordbase has a really weird Bob. Let's call him Bill. He's white instead of gold, and instead of always having ranger armor, his armor is randomized, and he can spawn with any set in the game. Here he is with Spec Ops, Minor, Ultra, Zealot, Field Marshal, General, and Officer. Here's a Bob on Nightfall, Tip of the Spear, Long Night of Solace. This is a Banshee Bob on Exodus. They're different from regular Banshees because they never attack, instead always flee and eventually despawn. Here's a Banshee Bob on New Alexandria. Here's a Bob on the package, the Pillar of Autumn, Lone Wolf. Firefight in Reach and ODST gives you the option to fight against heretic elites. These elites use human weapons, and holy crap are they deadly. Firefight is also the only environment that they can be encountered. Halo 4 only has a few instances of strange and unique enemies, the first of which can be found on Dawn. During the final section of the mission when the ship is falling apart, there's an elite that just dies if you hang out with him. Requiem also has one of these guys, as well as some grunts that also just die. If you set your difficulty to Legendary and progress all the way to where the elite attacks you with active camo, then backtrack to the previous section, a phantom filled with beam rifle elites will spawn. These are the only elites in Halo 4's campaign that hold these deadly weapons. The mission Forerunner, which is when you're introduced to the Prometheans, is the only time any of them are blue: Crawlers, Knights, and Watchers. Knights also have a chance of summoning auto-sentries, which means this is the only Halo game where you fight these little guys. If you start betraying your allies on Shutdown, all the Marines and Spartan 4s will become hostile. The weird thing is, once the initial group is killed off, more and more continue to spawn in, eventually culminating in a Marine that looks suspiciously like Sergeant Johnson. For some reason, he doesn't spawn in MCC, only the original Halo 4, but regardless, this is the only time Spartans are ever hostile. On Midnight, every player will encounter these weird Forerunner defense turrets, but they're worth mentioning because this is the only time you'll ever see them. They come in two variations. This one, and this one. Shooting these two things in the right order will spawn an enemy aggressor sentinel, the only one of its kind in Halo 4. He doesn't actually attack though. On the Spartan Ops mission Switchback, of the many crawlers you have to kill, one of them wields a light rifle. This never happens anywhere else. Halo 4 shipped with a new multiplayer mode called Dominion, and in this mode, each team had to fight for control of several bases. If you capture a base, these big turrets will spawn and shoot at the opposing team. That means the opposing team's turrets will shoot at you too. Halo 5 doesn't have a ton of enemies that are worth mentioning, but the first that is will be encountered in Osiris. This elite, much like the ones in Halo 4, just dies. Later in the mission is a gold elite with a very unique behavior. If he stays alive until most of the Prometheans are killed, he'll actually switch sides and become your ally. There's some cool lore behind this guy too. Playing Osiris on Legendary will spawn 7 hidden knives throughout the mission. If you shoot one, it'll catch on fire. If you shoot them all, a special knight and warden will spawn. Both of them are much larger than their standard counterparts. What a weird Easter egg. If you play through Blue Team on Legendary, make your way outside of Argent Moon, collect this rocket launcher, then stand on this weird thing, an elite piloting a special type of Banshee called a Ultra Banshee will spawn. After running down the side of the Guardian on Genesis, an enemy driving an Ultra Ghost will block your path. Much like the Banshee, it's one of a kind. One of the selling points of Halo 5 was a brand new large-scale multiplayer mode called Warzone. In this mode, AIs can spawn, but the weirdest of them are the Marines that protect the inside of both teams' bases. They're either blue or red, depending on which team they're on, and if you go into the enemy base, they'll try to kill you. Later in Halo 5's lifecycle, a new version of Firefight called Warzone Firefight was released to the masses. This new version of the fan-favorite mode pits you and a few other Spartans against waves of enemies and tons of unique bosses that can only be encountered in this mode. I'm not going to name them all because there's a total of 57, and that would just take way too long. Halo Infinite is still very new at the time of publishing this video. Chances are it has many unusual and interesting enemies hidden throughout its open world. But as of right now, other than the obvious HVTs you're tasked with eliminating, I've been unable to find any. As people continue to explore the surface of Zeta Halo, I'm sure new discoveries will be made, but until then, my journey to find strange baddies comes to a close. This is by no means a comprehensive list. In fact, I'm sure I missed some. If you know of any, let me know in the comments. If I missed enough, maybe I'll make another video covering them. Anyways, thanks for watching. Do me a favor and subscribe, hit like and share this video if you liked it. It helps the channel out a lot. Alright, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.